Alright, the next component we're going to work on will be progress item component. And this component is responsible for rendering list items on the progress page right here. So the first thing we're going to do in here is actually type props. This component accepts only one prop with a name activity, and the type of this prop will be activity itself, which we're going to import from types.ts. This is an interface we have defined earlier. As always, to be consistent, let's use word type while importing types. So we no longer have to use validation function to validate activity prop, so let's remove this import as well as this commented code. There is actually nothing else in this component that we could type, so let's move on and switch over to the next component, which will be remaining activity seconds. This component is responsible for rendering amount of seconds next to every activity list item. And as we can see in Vue Developer Tools, this component accepts one property with the name activity, just like the previous component. So what we could do in here is actually copy over the dynamic argument we have just used from the progress item component and paste it into this define props declaration inside remaining activity seconds component. Then we're going to import this interface inside this file and remove unused import. Also in this component we have a couple of things that we can assign explicit types for. For example, this computed property, the return value of disclosure will be an array of strings. And as for remaining seconds computed property, the return type for disclosure will be number. Moving on and switch over to the next component, the activity empty state. As we can see, this component doesn't have any scripts, so we can simply skip it and move on to the next one, the activity form. And this component is responsible for showing the activity creation form on the activities page. In this component, we don't have to explicitly assign the type for this name reactive variable, since TypeScript is able to automatically derive the proper type based on the initial value of this reactive variable. And as for the next function, since this function is asynchronous, it is going to return a promise. So we can use default type called promise as the return type for this function. And just because this promise is not going to hold any data, we use dynamic type argument void as the generic type. As always, before typing any Vue component, we have to apply attribute length with the value ts on the script tag. So we're done with this component. Move on to the next one, the header. This component renders the bar at the top of the page. As you can see, it does not contain any logic besides importing a couple of other components, so we could just assign attribute length with the value ts and move on to the next component. And as for the next component, it is contained inside the header component and responsible for showing the label at the top right corner of the application. There is not much logic in this component as well, so we can simply assign attribute length with the value ts and move on. The next component is called the logo, and it renders nothing else but simple logo of the application. So this component does not contain any logic as well, besides one function. So we can just assign return type of this function, which will be void. And lastly, we're gonna open up the next component, the now, which is responsible for showing navigation at the bottom of the page. In this component, we just add attribute length, and that will be it, because this is also a pretty simple component, just like other ones. And just to show you what the now component looks like, it is down here. This component contains other now item components responsible for rendering individual now items. And with that, we are finishing this lesson. Link to the repository of this project will be, as always, in the video description.